Well, welcome everybody to Wednesday Night Lab. I'm Tom Zimmer, UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. Also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4H. And those folks, welcome to Wednesday Night Lab. Next week, we're going to have Sundu Adapatu with the law school, and she'll be talking about climate change, environmental justice, and human rights. In 2 weeks, Taylor Seal, who's my colleague with Dane County Extension Community Youth Development, just got done with her Master's of Public Health. And she's got a very interesting thesis at the intersection of arts and public health. So she's going to be talking about positive youth development at the intersection of arts and public health, and some of the work that she's doing here with the arts community in Madison, and how that work she's doing to track the impacts that has on public health. So that's the next 2 weeks. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Hope to see you in the week and in 2 weeks.
And I have to figure, oh, there it is. So, I'm going to start over so we can cut this first part off the recording. Welcome everybody to Wednesday Night Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension Wisconsin 4H, and on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and UW-Madison Science Alliance. Thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Luke Richert. He's with the School of Pharmacy. You also have an appointment in the history department?
Affiliated.
He's an affiliate with the history department. And he's going to be talking with us about the history of pharmacy in Wisconsin, and specifically here at UW-Madison. So if you want to come up, Luke, I'm going to ask you the incredibly difficult 5 questions. Luke, where were you born?
I was born in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan. It's in Canada. Can you say that?
That. Hi, I've been to Saskatoon. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
I've even been to Regina. Ooh.
It's the capital of the province.
And Prairie provinces, man, can't beat them. And where'd you go to high school?
Bedford Road Collegiate Institute. It's in Saskatoon.
And where'd you go for your undergrad, and what did you study?
University of Saskatchewan, and history and political science.
And for your advanced degrees?
So moved away from home, moved out of Canada, went to Edinburgh, Scotland for my master's, and then went to London for a PhD, London, England.
Oh, thank you.
Oh.
Not London, Ontario. This is what he was getting at there. Well, those are 2 15-yard penalties for taunting, having to spend any time at all. So that'd be pretty tough. And then what brought you, or when did you come to UW-Madison?
It's a great opportunity to come to Madison in 2019.
Very good. So you were here for several months and then COVID hit.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to your talk, especially the Science Society and Psychedelics part. It's a very intriguing story over the years, over the decades. It's going to be great stuff. Would you please join me in welcoming Luke Richert to Wednesday Night at the Lab?
Hi. So, I'm based in the School of Pharmacy, and I'm also the historical director of the American Institute of the History of Pharmacy. And Tom, I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to talk to you this evening. I'm going to be honest, straightforward with you right from the start. So the idea behind this talk was to be maybe a little bit freewheeling and fast-paced, and maybe even a little bit of fun. So I'm going to throw a lot of information at you, And we'll just have to see how that sort of idea behind the talk actually turns out. So before I get started, I want to make a few really important acknowledgements, actually. This lab is really amazing. During the lockdown, it was a pleasure to watch from a distance, so I feel lucky to be here, and thanks to the organizers. 99% of the materials that you see in this talk are from the collections at the School of Pharmacy and the AIHP. So I have to thank the archivists that made this talk possible. And then it's also valuable, I think, to acknowledge everyone watching and listening. And it's also important to recognize that one of the reasons I'm here today is because it's National Pharmacy Week. And yeah, it's important to recognize the contributions that pharmacists and technicians are making to patient care in a variety of settings. One of the untold stories of COVID is just how important pharmacists were, being on the front lines, not only training pharmacists in their 3rd and 4th year, but also obviously the licensed pharmacists who are vaccinating people. It's very important to acknowledge them. And I should also give a shout out to the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy, which this year is celebrating its 80th anniversary. The AIHP was founded in 1941, has a very solid relationship with the UW School of Pharmacy. And just out of interest's sake, how many have heard of the AIHP? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people. So there are a few people in the room who have heard of the AIHP, but it has an 80-year history, and I'm going to get into it a little bit. And then lastly, before I get started, we're actually on the site of Relevance first pharmacy in Madison. So if you didn't know that, Oscar Relevance established a number of pharmacies across the state, became governor, and he actually gifted that site of his first pharmacy to the university, and it is based where we are at this very moment. And so I think it's just interesting to note that. And there he is, and that's an image from that first pharmacy. That's 1925. And there is sort of a deeper look into that flagship pharmacy that he gifted to the university. So my aim over the next 40 minutes or so is to expose you to perspectives in, around, within, perhaps beyond pharmacy. And what I'm going to do is discuss the history of pharmacy tradition in Wisconsin, particularly, which was initiated over a century ago, and which really began with the belief that science should be taught alongside the humanities. And over the course of the next 35, 40 minutes, I'm going to share with you some of the interdisciplinarity, some of the innovation, and I guess struggle, if you will, to blend scientific training with the liberal arts. And I'm going to tell you a little or a few facts about pharmacy and pharmaceuticals. And in the face of contemporary developments in psychedelic science and medicine on the UW campus very recently, I think that this history of pharmacy tradition continues to have a lot of relevance today. And so as I move along, I'm going to share some of the collections that we have, and I'm going to share some specific historical documents that scientists and historical researchers might use in the years ahead. At the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to share some news with you about what's happening right now. I'm going to try to impart some words of wisdom. Not entirely sure you'll think that's the outcome by the end of this, But as we see it, or as I see it, pharmacy history is unique to Madison. It's unique to Wisconsin, and that's important to know. And these are coming from the Chain Store Age magazine. So we are in changing times, friends. There's a lot of transition right now. A lot is happening in 2021, and history helps us see clearly. And I'm the type of historian that tries to leverage historical knowledge, connect it with what is going on in the labs in my building, work with the scientists who are at the bench, and convince, sometimes unsuccessfully, that science and psychedelic science requires important historical contextualization. That's the way to move forward, is to think about the past and the present working together. So it's helpful looking backward in order to see forward. And that'll help us get, if you will, in the know about contemporary discussions. So this matters. This matters for a number of reasons. One of the main reasons I often want to point people towards is that the drugstore and that the pharmacy is a fixture in our lives. The drugstore on Main Street has served as a bedrock in our civic life, and more than that, in the local and national economy. So, besides that, pharmacists and pharmacies are key drivers in the marketplace. They serve as the endpoint of the pharmaceutical supply chain. And they're the dispensers of a wide-ranging set of consumer goods. And some of these are non-threatening, and others are potentially very harmful to public health. So pharmacy history reveals a lot as well about scientific advancement. And I'll try and share some of that today. That's why I think this matters. That's why I do what I do. So I'm going to start my talk in earnest now with Edward Cremers, who lived from 1864 to 1941. He's the second director of the University of Wisconsin Department of Pharmacy. That later became the School of Pharmacy. He's a trained chemist and pharmacist. He did basic research on plant chemistry and was recognized as an expert on the chemistry of volatile oils. But beyond his own research program, he was one of the country's and world's leaders in the movement to offer complete four-year college courses and advanced degrees in pharmacy. So Cremers established a four-year course in pharmacy at the University of Wisconsin in 1892. That was a major development. And in his capacity as a director, he also promoted a scientific pharmaceutical curriculum and established the first American program of graduate study in pharmacy. So this is very important stuff in laying the groundwork for pharmacy education and training in the nation. He had multiple perspectives though. So throughout his career, he believed in and promoted the value of history and the value of humanistic research in pharmacy and the health sciences. So in 1892, just as one example, then he's a 27-year-old head of the Department of Pharmacy. Imagine that today. And he says, while giving a paper at the American Pharmaceutical Association meeting, and I quote, "In our utilitarian and materialistic age, too little attention is given to history, even in the academic courses of our colleges and universities." He's really going to bat for interdisciplinarity early on. At the time, he was given a paper on the study of materia medica, and essentially this quote was part of a larger critique of the state of pharmacy education at the time. He also mentioned, and I always love using this quote, that the isolation of professional students is today one of the curses of professional education. Daily contact with those whose thoughts run along other channels is one of the greatest factors in true education of all students. It's really pushing the boundaries by suggesting that we needed to think and interact with people who didn't have the same training or may not have the same belief system as our own. And in 1907, he introduced for the first time anywhere in the US an elective course about the history of pharmacy. And then ever since, the School of Pharmacy has offered that course. And it's pretty cool that I get to teach that course 114 years later. Now, the historical record isn't exactly clear on how his students felt about him. We don't know, in other words, how the curricular changes went down or how his students felt about blending science and the humanities. These students were voicing their opinion, though. These School of Pharmacy students were saying nuts to the faculty. You know, in pursuit of his interdisciplinary agenda, one that blended history and the sciences, Cremers, like any good dean and any good administrator, was out forming partnerships, developing contacts, drumming up business, if you will. And in these images, Cremers is posing with Sir Henry Welcome, the founder of the major pharmaceutical company, Burroughs Welcome. And the reason they had such a connection was that Sir Henry Welcome was actually born in Wisconsin and then moved away. And they kept up this relationship over the years. This is in 1936. Sir Henry was back in the United States at the Mayo Clinic receiving treatment, and he decided to come to Madison. Him and Cremers hung out, chatted, and just a little while later in 1936, Sir Henry died. But years earlier, Cremers had been corresponding with Henry Welcome about support for an experimental station for the cultivation of medicinal plants in the School of Pharmacy. He was trying to drum up business, a public-private partnership, essentially. And what you see in this piece of correspondence is that Sir Henry is saying, no, I'm not going to give UW any money for this experimental station. But he did say the state, Wisconsin, was delightful and salubrious, even when he said no to funding the pharmacy department. But Cremers was not just communicating with scientists and captains of industry like Welcome. He wasn't just trying to establish scientific research stations for experimentation. He was actually building bridges across all of campus. So here in 1915, Cremers is communicating with the Dean E.A. Burge over in Letters and Science. Burge would later become president of the university. Now, for all his strengths, Cremers was not known for his brevity. And this letter, which was 7.5 pages long, not sure if it was read in its entirety by Burge, but it was definitely revealing when we look back. It's a fascinating, overly long letter that showcases how Cremers was breaking new ground in teaching history, collecting documents, collecting artifacts, collecting ephemera that would be very important for future researchers, not just in the humanities, but also within the health sciences as well. So this letter shows that Cremers was pedagogically innovative and had a very interdisciplinary mindset. That the box at the bottom there is particularly revealing for me. What he's saying is he's thinking of himself as a collector and a pioneer for others. And so I find myself reflecting on this now and again when I'm in the archives and thinking about how different drugs were developed, how different pharmaceutical companies emerged. I'll move away from Cremers in a moment, but I just want to add another thought about his legacy having to do with drugs and medicines. The title of this talk does reference psychedelics. According to the historian John Parascandola, who has actually got his degree in the history of science here at UW and then moved away into to the NIH, he's analyzed Cremers thusly. He said that Cremers encouraged critical thought about consumption and control of substances in the US, and he encouraged the news media, political leaders, and pharmacy leaders to think about different meanings and assumptions associated with these words like drugs, narcotics, and medicines. Of course, these are issues that we struggle with today still. Language matters, law matters, and Cremers very much opposed prohibitionist impulses and prohibitionist organizations. And he argued that overly restrictive measures wouldn't solve the misuse of certain substances. And more than that, Cremers was concerned with the ability of researchers in the labs to carry out their agendas having to do with certain substances. And here I'm referring to, for example, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 that limited basic research into certain substances. So Cremers' views emanated from his own research agenda, which had to do with plant-based medicines, medicines that straddled the line between intoxicant and therapies. So the documents here illustrate that Cremers was in close contact with industry about cannabis medicines, for example. Eli Lilly wanted to get its hands on Cremers and UW's samples of American cannabis. So that's just one image from our artifact collection. I love the letter that's sent to Cremers from Lilly. The language is always amazing to me. We're very anxious to obtain any quantity possible of American cannabis, high test. Will you please advise us if you're able to supply any quantity of this drug and also submit us a large sample? And then 2 weeks later, Lilly, desperate to get its hands on a sample for its own testing, potential marketing, we've not heard from you in reply to our letter concerning American cannabis high test. Will you please advise us if you're able to supply us with any quantity of this drug, and if possible, submit us a liberal sample. I know that my wonderful colleague, Natalie Schmitz, was here some time ago talking about cannabinoids and her research area related to cannabinoids. She's an expert in this field, particularly with palliative care. And Dr. Schmitz is the co-instructor on a course in the School of Pharmacy, which I contribute to. And these documents suggest a really long pattern of scientific research into cannabis and the types of therapies it might be used for. So we're getting to the middle of the talk. Cremers was always thinking about what was next, about tomorrow, what about the future of pharmacy and the future of pharmacy history, what he wondered lay on the road ahead. And it was a little up in the air until in the summer of 1939. In the summer of 1939, Cremers, who was suffering from various illnesses, recruited George Erdang to Madison to help complete a history of pharmacy textbook. They were based on all of these historical materials that Cremers had been compiling and collecting. And that book was finally finished up in 1940, this textbook.
Can you identify the people?
The four people, well, on the left is Glenn Sonnedecker. Glenn Sonnedecker was the first PhD in the history of science here on the UW campus. And then he became the individual who held and sort of took the torch and led the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy and the history of pharmacy up until very recently. Glenn Sonnedecker, Tom, just passed away at the age of 102, and that was just recently. On the far right is a Canadian. His name's Ernst Stieb. Ernst Stieb also did his PhD here in the history of science with, I think, a degree in biochemistry as well, and then moved back to Canada at the University of Toronto. The fellow looking over Erdang's shoulder is escaping me at the moment. Does anyone, if you know the person, just yell it out? Well, thanks for that. It's good context for these individuals. Erdang, I should just say, because I occupy a chair named after Erdang, I should give you a bit of background on him. He fled Nazi Germany in 1938, and he originally moved to New York with his family, left all his belongings behind, and then Cremers gave him the opportunity to get a position here in Madison. And then what we've actually got over in the School of Pharmacy is a lot of Erdang's possessions that he had shipped from Germany after the war concluded. Getting Erdang in is really what solidified the history of pharmacy tradition in Wisconsin. And what happened was that they created an institute. So Erdang, the director of the School of Pharmacy named Arthur Ull, Edward Cremers, and Lloyd Parks were some of the founders of this institute. And the institute was formed in 1941. And I just laid down the original objectives of this institute because they reflected this idea of contributing to science, society, very much so. And so the idea, the bottom point is always worth highlighting, that the Institute was to be of use, especially of medicine, to promote this mutual scientific, professional, and social understanding and progress derived from working together. And so this institute was created in 1941, and that was the same year that Edward Cremers died. So there are a few important dates and milestones having to do with this institute, for which I now serve as the historical director. You had the creation of a journal called Pharmacy and History in 1959, which was led by Glenn Sonnedecker. You had an endowment, and thank you to the donors that enabled the AIHP to expand its operations in 1983. Skipping ahead, other donors to the School of Pharmacy put forward resources that helped establish the chair. And then importantly, what we've seen in 2019 when I arrived is sort of a splitting of responsibilities, where you have an executive director and you have a historical director. And the mission, before I move away from this, is to advance knowledge and understanding the history of pharmacy and medicines. So that is the mission. What does the place do? Why does it exist? Well, there are those bullet points that were laid out in 1941, but when you break it down into buckets, it is collections, all the materials that Cremers was working on and could put together, the programming, the online stuff, the grants that we give away to historians and to pharmacists or scientists for that matter, and then the publications. We put out publications like that journal, Pharmacy and History. It started out looking like this, and then it changed pretty radically and started looking like this. Then it got really, really radical and started looking like this. It changed again though right away, and it looked like that. But since 1959, it's evolved. There it is. But over time, you've seen some changes with how Pharmacy and History of the Journal works. We get contributions from interdisciplinary contributions in trying to honor the legacy of Cremers. And just this past year, I decided and we decided that it was important to form a relationship with the UW Press. And why that hadn't been done before I arrived, I don't know. But we're now working with UW Press, and we altered the title. And this is what it looks like. History of Pharmacy and Pharmaceuticals. Moving forward is what it looks like. And the artwork comes from a Madison-based fellow. And we're just trying to make sure that we stay local with the journal, and as well as honor this tradition. So that's the publication side. Then the programming side, well, here it is 10 years after the founding, when you could gather in person and have conferences and have a laugh. Very important in the AIHP's history. So what does the place look like and what is on offer? I think it's important to delve a little more deeply into the types of materials that were collected and what the types of materials might be used. So just by a show of hands, who has heard of a selfie? Everyone has heard of a selfie. Has anyone heard of a shelfie? Some people. Well, this is one shelfie of our world-leading collection on our trade catalogs. So trade catalogs provide amazing insight into what pharmaceutical companies were selling to the general public, as well as to physicians. I think this the Smithsonian has got us beat when it comes to our trade catalog collection, but that's about it. Doesn't look like much, but it's it is one of the best in the world. This is another shelfie of really old books. And then Erdang Photobombs shelfies. We try to have fun with Erdang, putting them in different parts of our collections. I'm personally not a fan of bow ties, but I definitely respect his legacy. My research chair is obviously named after him. He looks pretty stern. He looks like a pretty stern guy. This guy over here looks less stern, more perhaps spaced out after a day of digging around in the archives, putting together this talk. And what was I digging around for? I don't actually recall, but there's lots on offer if you wanted to drop in. So maybe you wanted to drop in and learn a little bit about adulteration and counterfeiting. The Go Big read just a couple of years back was almost, well, that's what the Poison Squad, Harvey Washington Wiley did to try to understand the adulteration of different foods and drugs in the United States. But maybe you're interested in stabilization mechanisms of drugs, or maybe you're interested in the merchandising methods On the promotional side, we have this for the researchers of all stripes. It could be that you're interested in C39K. Wait a second, that's not a thing. It's just that we have so many materials that we haven't been able to adequately label them all. We have Harry Potter fans in the room, perhaps. I think I've read all the Harry Potter books with my children now 3 times over. And this really old book is from the 1500s. Looks like it's from Harry Potter. Looks like it potentially would eat you. You're not going to learn spells, Accio, Lumos, Abracadabra in this book. It is an amazing artifact that we have, really one of the oldest and most important pieces in our collection. If you drop by, you may want to learn about American pharmacy practice, whether or not it's clinical pharmacy, hospital pharmacy, we have that for you. Maybe the pharmaceutical era is what you're interested in. It could be that you want to learn about Parke-Davis, Eli Lilly, Merck, basic research that went on here in Wisconsin. That material is on offer. I have to give a shout out again to Burroughs Welcome, which is on the far left. Welcome, of course, was from Wisconsin. And, you know, in 1883, he moved into one of the first commercial buildings in London to be lighted entirely by electricity. And in the same year, he established these new pharmaceutical preparations that were called Kepler products. On the right-hand side, we have one of many cartoons having to deal with pharmaceutical advertising, particularly patent medicine. The one chap on the far right there is particularly healthful as he drinks Parker's tonic, and the fellow on the left is not looking particularly healthful. Parker's tonic was found to, when it was taken into a lab, contain, what was it? It was 46% alcohol. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that would maybe not make you healthful. If you came into the collections at the School of Pharmacy and the AIHP, you could learn about psychedelic medicines. So Mezcal buttons, for example, maybe you're interested in mescaline and the use of mescaline. There are not many patents right now that are being put forward for the alkaloid mescaline because of its pharmacokinetics. It's not a proportional and linear substance vis-a-vis psilocybin. And what we're seeing now is psilocybin testing going on in the School of Pharmacy over the past number of years as part of phase 2 trials in the United States. But with mescaline, you may want to learn about its history and its study, its physiological action upon man, and how this was interpreted in the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s. And I'll return to psychedelics, but you may want to come in and learn more about pharmacy history from a racial perspective. Indeed, there is not enough written on African Americans in the history of pharmacy. Here is Leo Butts, the first African American graduate in the UW School of Pharmacy. Greg, what year was that?
1920.
That was 1920. We had the first African American. He is a pioneer, seriously a serious critical thinker, and had to put up with a lot of prejudice in the School of Pharmacy at the time. You may want to come in and learn about the different products that were available. If you're a pharmacy historian, it's not just about the actions and the delivery systems of different substances. It's also about peanut brittle and the different types of hypodermic syringes on the left that you could get in pharmacy trade catalogs. It could be that you want to learn about the different technological innovations within the community pharmacy, whether or not it's the mimeograph or whether or not it's the calculator that led to advancement in pharmacy practice in the United States. Maybe you're looking to understand racial divides in the country, intractable racial divides that have characterized this country as well as my own for a long period of time. And one way of doing that would be to think about the civil rights era and how African-American activists challenged segregation via sit-ins in pharmacies and drugstores. Maybe that is not your interest. Maybe your interest is just one or two African-American pharmacists and how they broke the ownership divide, how you began to see more and more Black ownership of community pharmacies in the country. Maybe you want to learn a little bit about how certain African-Americans pushed the boundaries in clinical pharmacy, in pharmacotherapy fields. And so, as I've already mentioned, African-Americans in pharmacy, in the history of pharmacy, is deeply understudied at this period of time. As is the role of women in pharmacy. In the 1950s, less than 10% of women were pharmacists in this country. And now, 2021, it's roughly 55 to 60% of all pharmacists are women. And so coming into the Institute, you'll learn about women in pharmacy, in operating in different situations and circumstances, carrying out different duties, whether or not it was through compounding, whether or not it was through dispensing, whether or not they're working in hospital settings or not. And so just as in the case of African-American pharmacy, there is a lot to be learned about the role of pioneering women in pharmacy settings, either as scientists, as owners, or as retailers. And I absolutely have to talk about Edna Gleason for a minute or two. Gleason, who is a trained pharmacist in California and a drugstore owner in the 1930s, it was a path breaker in so many ways. What she did was lead a crusade against price slashing of big firms. And so she got together with other pharmacy store owners and said that we need to push back against larger consolidation of chain pharmacies, what we'd think of now as CVS or Walgreens. She said it was very important that small business owners work together. She emerged as a defender of traditional pharmaceutical practices and community activism at the same time. Not only did she offer medical advice, she also offered delivery services. She did prescription compounding. And these were services that were not offered by larger retail outlets all in one place. And so she earned the nickname Dynamite. Just can't not tell the story of Edna Gleason. And, you know, before I move on to the final stages of this talk, I just wanted to highlight a few more sources that are of interest for people doing the history of pharmacy. A few more interesting sources from my perspective. It could be that you hate the idea of studying topics like soap, that maybe it makes you cringe and maybe it makes you feel gross, but soap was one of these things that pharmacists and small drugstores were often asked for. And so studying that sort of social history of pharmacy is, I think, well, interesting to me at least. as is the electric hairbrush. It's a remarkable history. Again, this is coming from pharmacy magazines. This is what you'd get this is 1922, I believe. You know, or maybe you're wondering about how pharmacies and retail stores are designed. What was the floor plan? What was the massing like? What kind of architecture and design went into selling goods in a given store? And so I always love showing to students and others some of the weirder displays. This one in particular is a bunch of stuffies, stuffed animals, very harmless, pastoral, and fuzzy, literally fuzzy. And finally, again, just taking you back, what you would get in the drugstore. You would get loony lids, and apparently it was an epidemic to get a loony lid. And again, these are the types of goods that you would see popping up in chain store age. Could be that wacky hats are not your thing. They're not really my thing. But it could be as a pharmacist, and especially during National Pharmacy Week, that it's important to talk about professional identity. So right off the top, I mentioned that pharmacists have played an incredibly important role in this era of COVID, in the widespread vaccination of people in the state, and not just in our state, but across the US. One thing that it raises this mass vaccination is the professional identity of pharmacists and how they have struggled with physicians for different types of authority in the medical marketplace. What are pharmacists allowed to do? What are they not allowed to do? Why are they not allowed to do it? How have physicians pushed back against pharmacists? And then how have pharmacists reacted to that? William Apple is arguably one of the most important pharmacists in the country, in the country's history. He went to UW-Madison in the 50s, got his PhD in pharmacy admin in 1954. Then he was based at the APHA for roughly 25 years, and he was an aggressive leader on behalf of pharmacy. And he worked tirelessly to get pharmacy recognized fully as a healthcare profession on equal footing with medicine in the United States. So he was president of the American Council on Pharmaceutical Education from 64 to 69. He was president of the National Drug Trade Conference from 67 to 70. And the list goes on with his influence. As a leader at the APHA in various capacities, he testified in Washington at over 50 committees that were essentially instrumental in shaping the regulatory architecture governing pharmaceuticals in the country. And he was also instrumental in suggesting that pharmacists should have a greater standing in the country. And without that background, without someone like William S. Apple, we're not entirely sure whether or not pharmacists would be able to be dispensing vaccines out in the street during COVID, whether or not state governments would allow training pharmacists to do this sort of work. We have a lot to be proud of in this state when it comes to the vaccination rate. And while we do have a lot that we could be improving on, Apple is one of these individuals that was pushing the boundaries having to do with professional pharmacist identity. He wanted pharmacy to remain an independent profession, economically separate from medicine. What he wanted in a 1967 speech when he was accepting pharmacy's highest honor was move towards pharmacist-provided drug therapy, meaning a greater role in pharmacotherapy, more in-clinic, inpatient services that were delivered, and greater autonomy from physicians, essentially. In 71, at Apple's urging, the APA came out in favor of states allowing generic drug substitutions. And he was making the point that pharmacists had the expertise to select the proper drug among multiple options with the same active ingredients. So until that point, what you had seen is generic drug substitution was not allowed across the country at the state level, meaning that people had access to patent, more expensive therapies, not having access to cheaper generic drug substitutions. He made the case that pharmacists had the training to protect people, protect patient safety. They had the knowledge to accurately assess whether a generic drug at that time was safe. So the end, bringing us up to the present. I think that there's a bright future ahead for you now as we are arriving at this conclusion. But I want to tie some of this history of pharmacy back to the present. And I particularly want to use psychedelic science and psychedelic medicine to close out this talk. So in recent months, the UW School of Pharmacy has launched a new master's program in psychoactive pharmaceutical investigation. And as well, the School of Pharmacy is now home to the UW's Transdisciplinary Center for Research in Psychoactive Substances. And in both cases, in the case of this new master's program, in the case of this new research center, the pharmacy history tradition and Cremers' legacy are both very much present. So here's just a breakdown of the courses that are on offer in this new master's program. So in the case of this new PPI program, which was established to train professionals to operate in the emergent psychoactive pharmaceutical industry, what you see is that history and other disciplines are firmly embedded in the curriculum. And the idea is to provide these professionals with holistic training, just like Cremers was advocating over a century ago. In the newly established center, it's exactly the same, where you're seeing people across all campus who are contributing to the science, but also other research endeavors. This is so crucially important from my perspective that we're honoring Cremers' legacy, because the newly emerging psychedelic industry has long-standing historical problems to reckon with. In a general sense, this industry, which is projected to be in the billions within the next 5 to 7 years, is currently divided between profit and nonprofit outfits. There's more capital than ever flowing into newly created startups. Patenting has become a particularly divisive issue for some in the community. For example, how is indigenous knowledge being used or co-opted by scientists? How are companies, brand new companies that are popping up, bioprospecting in parts of the world, and how are they using indigenous knowledge? Is it an ethical way or a non-ethical way? And This is just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond those issues that were just on the screen before you, psychedelic science and psychedelic medicine has typically and historically been a very white, male, cisgendered field. Essentially, there's been a DEI problem, whether or not it's in study design and the basic research. What's the problem is that it hasn't included women or persons of color. And another serious issue related to this emerging psychedelic industry is the not yet fully understood problem of abuse in psychedelic therapy. Many more studies have to be done on this, but the issue has much to do with the absence of proper regulation and standardized training, which we here at UW are hoping to do with the new master's degree. So the idea that you have multiple voices and multiple perspectives within that curriculum and within the center is truly important as this industry grows over the next 5-10 years. It's important that the scientific side is balanced out with other perspectives. So here's an example. MindMed is one of these newly capitalized emerging companies, and they just had approval of a mescaline study very recently. And it's a phase 1 clinical trial evaluating acute effects of mescaline. We've discussed mescaline very briefly here, with varying dosage. The company is hoping to start the trial in Switzerland, in Basel, Switzerland. And the lead researcher has commented, we believe that this is going to provide the first modern research data on mescaline regarding dosing and mechanism of action in humans. The natural outcome of this would be to patent the mescaline, and then that patent would go to an examiner to try and understand if this is a legitimate patent or not. What Matthias Lichty is suggesting is that they're going to provide the first modern research data on mescaline regarding dosing. But as I've already showed you in a previous slide, we have bountiful papers in our collection to do with mescaline, this particular substance. And what matters about the information that we hold in our historical collections is that it provides some information about dosage forms and some research on how it was used in humans. Meaning the historical information that we have could eventually go to a patent examiner to help determine whether or not this drug would move eventually down the road into the medical marketplace. What else can I say about mescaline and the patenting and study of mescaline? Well, how is it done? How is it actually done? And Rough and Ready Research, 1887 style, written by George Bender, is based on papers that we have in our collection. And he makes the case that what's important is sourcing that material, the Mezcal buttons. How do you get that raw material from point A to point B? How do you get into the lab? He's talking essentially about going into places like Mexico and elsewhere, harvesting the materials that they have, putting it into a lab-based setting, and then using it for basic research. Is that ethical? How is that conducted? Is it done with local indigenous groups, or is it done in an independent fashion? These types of historical documents help lend insight into use of 5-MeO-DMT, ayahuasca in Brazil, or the use of other psychedelic substances in places with indigenous populations that have used this sort of material for hundreds of years. So what I'm getting at is that there has to be a discussion in a UW center about psychoactive substances, about these ethics. There has to be that same sort of discussion in the training of professionals moving forward. And that's why the history of pharmacy matters for this new industry. And I'll wrap up by saying that psilocybin research is making for very strange political bedfellows. This is inside Wisconsin from earlier in the year, just a couple months back. What we're seeing here in Madison is a new 93,000 square foot facility that's being built through Promega that is going to build on this psychoactive industry. So this is something that is happening right now, and building the Cremers legacy into the discussion is important. And that's the end. In the middle of the National Pharmacist Week, I would just say that we need to continue to leverage history to understand science, medicine, and society. And thank you for your attention.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, first, I was just wondering, do you know what the circumstances were behind that, the photo saying nuts to the faculty? And my other question, I imagine that there was a lot of very bitter turf wars between pharmacists and doctors, particularly with the AMA, and I imagine that the AMA was very reluctant to shed any of its turf to other professions. So I'm wondering how hard fought were those battles, and what type of resistance did pharmacists encounter? Thanks.
So the reason behind the students saying nuts to the faculty is lost in the historical records. I really wish I could say what it is that drove them to do that, but I absolutely can't. All I know is that probably won't stop anytime soon. It's just how it plays out is different. As for struggles, sometimes very bitter struggles between pharmacists and physicians, this is a long-standing issue, and it's actually occurring right now. I point you towards a new article in Slate that just came out 2 days ago that chronicles how physicians are placing in their offices vending machines, RX vending machines. So you can just basically, like, instead of getting a Coke out of the vending machine, you get your prescription out of the vending machine. And the head of the APHA, his name is Scott Knorr, has said that this is a practice that can't go on. That this is simply, it runs counter to pharmacist training. So I'll just point you towards a contemporary example to say that this hasn't gone away at all. Thanks for the question, sir.
In Europe, Germany in particular, the apothecist was essentially what a modern internist would be. That was not mentioned. There was a tremendous variation of prestige, knowledge, and countermanding of medical orders by pharmacists. That came to a stop the pharmacists were the apothecasts were a very strong organization and very heavily aligned with the Nazi Party. And Pervitin, which is methamphetamine, was essentially granted to the Nazi Party as their cash cow by the apothecasts. So yes, these struggles have gone on for a long time, but there's another side.
Yeah, it's an important observation, and I don't disagree. National context matters hugely, and levels of prestige in Germany were not the same as they were in France or the UK or the United States. Your point is absolutely well taken too about how the Nazi Party worked closely with the drug industry. And I'd point you towards a couple of books on this subject too.
The use of drugs in Nazi Germany is extremely good public book, and really gets into this very heavily. The marketing, from a position, the marketing of the drug companies hasn't really changed in a century. The way they can situate product into the medical stream, the fact that from raw material to retail, there may be 100,000% profit. This is pretty amazing. When we look at Dr. Hoffman, Dr. Hoffman owns a patent on lysergic acid, diethylene, LSD. Co-owns it with the CIA, by the way. At the time, he was working for Smith, Fine and French. There has always been a strong movement within the pharmaceutical industry to establish it as an entity unto itself, and being a multinational conglomerate. You mentioned Burroughs went from Burroughs to Burroughs Welcome. Burroughs Welcome that's who they became. But there's incredibly incestuous relationships here. Most new drugs aren't developed by big drug companies. They're developed by very small ones, and there are feeder systems. I don't know where I'm going with that, so I'm just going to hand it back to you.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
Did you want to comment?
No, I mean, your comments are really well taken. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question. You mentioned about patentability, that they're looking at. Do you think that they're looking to their patentability on natural medicines and such that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, or synthetic representations of these types? Where do you think they're going with it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, so the synthetic representations for sure, but also forms of dosage, administration, and there's also patents from certain companies. There's one called Compass, there's another called Atai Life Sciences, where set and setting itself. So the surroundings are also being folded into the patents. So that includes how the treatment room looks, what kind of art is on the wall, what kind of music is playing. So some of the patents are extremely expansive. So it runs the gamut, I suppose. It
So
is.
it's more or less like a design patent.
Yeah, that's accurate. That's accurate. And part of the newly emergent industry, wings of this new industry are really rejecting the notion of widespread patenting that they call patent trolls. So the notion of trying to patent, the essentially the decor in a therapy room is something that people are rejecting. So it runs the gamut, sir.
Other questions?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, further to the one of the previous questions, I think it was in the case of Germany, it was the Wehrmacht that was first to use the methamphetamines on soldiers to keep them alert. And my question is this: I mean, with all this new emphasis on psychedelic medicines, I was curious to know, do you think that they have genuine bona fide psychotropic applications, or do you think it's just a fad because of all the interest in recent years in recreational drug use? Thanks.
So the first part of the question about widespread use of methamphetamines, again, I'd say national context matters here, because there was a high rate of amphetamine use in the United States as well as Canada in the 1940s, 1950s. There's a great book called On Speed by Nick Rasmussen that talks about how physicians were writing a lot of prescriptions for amphetamines. As to the question about fad, I don't think that I'd be in a position to say psychedelic medicine is faddish. You're seeing the NIH, FDA, major universities, including our own, they're devoting a lot of resources in clinical trials in different phases to try and understand how psilocybin or LSD or MDMA are used for a host of medical problems, whether or not that's treatment-resistant depression or for end-of-life therapy. You're seeing a lot of basic research that isn't suggestive of faddishness.
So I have a question regarding the history, I guess, and actually kind of a projection forward. So in the 60s, you had Timothy Leary and LSD movement, and then there was the reactionary. There's obviously a counterbalance to that. And some say we probably went too far with the illegality of psychedelic drugs. I want to know, how do we, as we move forward and progress with the study of the clinical trials, how do we prevent a similar negative reactionary force going forward, knowing what we've learned from the past?
It's a really good question. Really good question. So I would immediately point you towards a book called Acid Revival. And so in this book, Acid Revival, what you have is an ethnographer, anthropologist, writing about the basic researchers now in labs in Switzerland, at Johns Hopkins, at Imperial College London. And these basic researchers who are at the forefront of the psychedelic industry are very mindful of that sort of the taint of Leary, the road that he went down. And so they're very circumspect about avoiding what Leary did. And so what you're seeing is people like Johnson, who's at Johns Hopkins, or Carhart Harris, who's at UCSF. What they're doing is they're avoiding any sort of impropriety. They're following the letter of the law as closely as they can. They're working in all the regulatory channels. And they also the way they act and dress even is very, very sort of mainstream, for lack of a better word. So there's no tie-dyes, there's no sandals, there's no beads, there's no long hair. These guys are very serious researchers doing very serious business because they're aware 100% of what happened in the 60s and 70s, and they want to desperately avoid that.
Another question.
In the cannabis industry. In the cannabis industry, and it is an industry, we see a lot of research being done, but it certainly doesn't fit into an academic profile. Yet it's a people's research. We look at the use of ketamine and the sudden proliferation of ketamine clinics across the country, well lodged within medical facilities. And it does seem that in some ways, a lot of it, put simply, trains already left the station. There's no way going to slow down this or slow down the work of people with CRISPRs in another area of science. There's a lot of things happening outside of academia in these areas. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that there is different regulatory structures in place with cannabis where you have sort of all sorts of laws in this country at the state and local level that sometimes come into conflict. So you have two distinct markets. You have a medical market for cannabis, and then you would have a personal use or recreational market. And these two markets operate sometimes in concert with each other and sometimes in opposition to each other. And so, you know, my colleague in the School of Pharmacy, Dr. Schmitz, works in the medical marketplace with cannabinoids and is a licensed pharmacist who dispenses cannabis in the state of Minnesota. And she is very aware of sort of the slippery slope or the sort of odd footing that she's on as a pharmacist. She is in the state of Minnesota, licensed to dispense, but at the same time, maybe some of her customers don't want to pay those prices and will go to the underground. So this is me just riffing off of your question a little bit, but I guess just summing up that you know the state of cannabis legislation right now in the country makes it very difficult for pharmacists, physicians, let alone patient consumers, to operate with any sort of understanding of what's happening. It's just very confusing.
I have a question from the chat from Raj. Does the American Institute of Pharmacists discuss the impact of current advanced technologies such as AI, which in Wisconsin is artificial insemination and the rest of the world is artificial intelligence, such as AI and robotics on the very profession of pharmacists? And can we glean anything from AIHP and how we progress through history? Profession. That might be two questions there. Raj, I didn't get that right. What's the effect of AI and robotics on pharmacists? And then what are we gleaning from AIHP on how progress through history is affecting the profession?
Well, thanks, Raj. They are good but tricky questions. The one on robotics and the use of AI in pharmacy, I'm not sure I'm equipped necessarily to answer. I'd certainly be willing to do a deep dive and think more seriously after conversations with colleagues in the School of Pharmacy. Certainly, we've seen very large companies such as Amazon recently get into the pharmacy space and get a better understanding of purchasing preferences. And that is something that has been discussed by the Wisconsin Pharmaceutical Society, but then also at the national level. So what are the entrants of really large corporations with a ton of data at their disposal mean for prescription drugs and generic drugs in the country? But then secondly, the idea was, what can the AIHP teach us about the use of technology more generally? I think is the thrust of the question. And what we've seen is that records from the 1880s, 1920s, 1940s up to the present suggest that pharmacy practice is in a constant state of evolution. And the pharmacy practice is negotiated by technological advancements and impacted by technological advancements. And so I threw up on the screen a couple of images having to do with how pharmacy practice is modified by mimeograph machines. Pharmacy practice is advanced by hydraulic carriers. Essentially, the idea of a hydraulic machine is going to allow you to store more goods in your space more easily. So technology is undeniably important in the history of pharmacy. And I recognize that that's a fairly general cop-out answer.
Show some, your collection of advertisements, catalogs, and that kind of thing. Cremers had a big interest in the humanities. And I almost included in this week a mention of two of my favorite pharmacists. One is Mr. Gower from It's a Wonderful Life, mostly because the telegram shows that his son died of influenza. It puts that all in context in a way that you miss that 2.5 seconds of the telegram and how he responded and how he's portrayed. Part where this is your life that he did exist.
Yep.
And then Aerosmith, which was the first place I ever saw the phrase Materia Medica. And Aerosmith was a pretty big book in 1925, coming up on the centennial of it. It looked into this idea of research universities and how they make medicines and all this stuff. Does your collection have, or could you imagine having the collection expand the role of pharmacists and pharmacy and pharmaceuticals and drugs in popular culture, literature, books, and movies, and that type of probably music? I'm trying to think of the Beatles song that had to do with, well, we're not sure. So
Yeah, one thing I didn't touch on, Tom, was we do have a pharmaco-literary collection that that is essentially a bunch of books, excellent books, some not so good books, fictional, that help tell the story of pharmacy, medicines, and drugs. That is available for people to come in and consult. And I would say too that absolutely we are looking to expand in the future, having to do with popular culture, but in other areas as well, related to drug development. So that may mean in the next couple of years, having interviews with individuals in the Wisconsin biotech sector to try and understand what it was like for them. So an oral interview would essentially be part of a larger collection of recordings that historians could then consult in the years ahead.
One last question?
I was be interested in knowing which discipline came first, history of pharmacy or history of medicine, or did they develop concurrently? Thanks.
It's a good question. I think that I'm not sure, sir, if I have a good answer for that. Within Germany and France, you have history of pharmacy traditions that extend back much farther than here in the United States. And it goes to the gentleman's point about the power of apothecaries in other places. Here in the United States, the history of pharmacy is a relatively narrow sub-discipline compared to the history of medicine. And that has a lot to do with medical schools' willingness to fund academic positions. So medical schools would say, we're going to create a line for a humanist to come into the school to help educate doctors about how they ought to do their job. And so the teaching remit would have to do with ethics, be very case-oriented. But honestly, you didn't see that same sort of allocation of resources for positions in schools of pharmacy. So I think that the outcome probably is that the history of medicine field grew, whereas the history of pharmacy field perhaps didn't.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
We'll see you next week for climate change and social justice.